Hello everyone, my name is Paul Buitink and welcome to our fireside chat with Charles Hoskinson. My co-hosts are Job Hartog of blocktrail.com and Tim Pastor of Identify. Charles is a mathematician, founder of the Bitcoin Education Project, former Ethereum CEO, TEDx speaker, and now working on exciting new projects. We will discuss his concerns about Bitcoin and Ethereum and what he thinks of all the other technologies out there poised to decentralize the world. Viewers are encouraged to ask questions using the Q&A tool, and don't forget to subscribe and circle and like us. Hi Charles, thanks for being on the show today.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me on.
Yeah, so first question that's probably still on a lot of people's minds. Why did you leave Ethereum? Because you were so enthusiastic about it and I thought you were a great spokesperson.
Well, I had a lot of fun with Ethereum. I guess we should probably tell a little bit about the history. So when I first came on Ethereum, it was December of 2013, a very early white paper describing the technology. And what I did for them was basically help them structure both the company as well as explore different ways of getting the project funded, from VC funding to potentially doing a crowd sale. I also helped set up the entire Swiss operation, so we basically got a tax ruling from the government of Zug. We also wrote some of the AML and KYC regulations via an SRO structure in Switzerland, so we could get some clarity on exactly how to accept Bitcoin payments in that country. And then moving forward, we had to come to a decision of whether to do a for-profit entity or a not. My belief was to do a hybrid structure, where we would do a for-profit entity and have a VC come on in, give us some money, build up the protocol, and then once Ethereum was ready to launch, actually do an Ether sale, blacklist in the United States, and have that fund a not-for-profit with a separate board. They chose to go in a different direction, and they went 100% not-for-profit, and they decided to move a little bit away from that structure. And so I left in June, and I wish them well.
Yeah, but so it sounds like there was this difference of opinion as to how to structure and raise the funds, but the dream you guys shared was the same, or did you also have different visions on how to develop the protocol and how to build?
Well, I mean, with all technology, there's always going to be taste differences. For example, I believe there should only be a single code base. Also, I was a huge fan of doing the whole thing on Node, and where and when possible using Google Native Client. I really like the Google stack. I think it's easy to build things. You could rapidly deploy things. The security model is great. Also, my belief was that it's really necessary to push us towards one-click install. You need to have a dApp browser. You need to have a decentralized app store. You need to be able to just click a single button to get an application, whatever that application happens to be. And so I felt that the Google ecosystem was uniquely positioned to allow us to do that. Most of it's, if not all of it's, open source, number one. Number two, the security model is well reasoned. But they decided to choose a different tech stack. They have 5 code bases they're working with. Until recently, 4 programming languages they developed and 3 protocols that they've written: Whisper, Swarm, and Ethereum. And frankly, I think they could have done the same with Telehash and BitTorrent. But that's a difference of technological opinion, and they're the ones writing the code. They're the ones taking the execution risk, so they get the right to make that decision.
And are you still advising them? Are you still sort of part of an advisory
team? I haven't
team?
had anything to do with the project since June of 2014.
Right. And you also left Invictus Innovations in the past, who created Bitshares. Could you elaborate on that decision?
Well, yeah, so with Invictus, that was a very different situation. So I bootstrapped the company, I brought in the VC funding, and Dan and I were working together pretty closely on exactly how we wanted to build out Bitshares and what we wanted to do with that ecosystem. And the issue there was more philosophical. So unlike Ethereum, where I really do believe that we need to decentralize the internet, and I really do believe in Internet 3, it's just a difference of how to get there from technology. From the Invictus standpoint, really the way Dan runs that company is it's a referendum on his political philosophy. He's a volunteerist, he's a libertarian, and he's a strong Austrian. And so every product decision that he makes and every business decision he makes is from that lens. And I, on the other hand, said, wow, we have investors. We kind of have a fiduciary obligation to them. If they bought, equity in Invictus Innovations, this company has to kind of grow, and we have to have a return on investment for them. We're not here to prove Ludwig von Mises right or wrong. We're here to build a company. So we kind of butt heads a lot, and at the end of the day, one of us had to go, and there were 3 Larimers and 1 Hoskinson. So and I was living in Dan's dad's apartment apartment in Floyd, Virginia, which, by the way, Stan Larimer and Pam are some of the nicest people I've ever met in my life. So, I went, and that's fine. It was a philosophical disagreement at its core about how to run a company and also what was the purpose of Bitshares. I was interested in it namely because I felt that one of the biggest barriers to adoption in the Bitcoin space is volatility. It's really hard to convince people to buy Bitcoin and hold Bitcoin if the price is always going up 20% or down 20%. And the core value proposition of Bitshares was this notion of a value-stable currency, BitUSD. So basically, you get something that tracks the U.S. dollar. It was a fascinating experiment. Even in failure, it would tell you a lot. So I was really interested in that. Second, I was really interested in the whole notion of decentralized exchange. I'm a big believer in the Internet of blockchains, and I think that there's not going to be just one dominant currency. There's going to be an ecosystem of currencies, probably regionally and application specific. And so it's a really good idea to figure out how to transact between these and have value flow between them. I mean, this was 2013, long before sidechains. And so it was really exciting to work on a project like that and have that kind of initial focus. I really wasn't so interested in the whole idea of DAX and decentralized autonomous companies and also proving Austrian economics or voluntarism or any of these things. I felt like that was a really fun thing to explore, but Bitshares as it was designed didn't have the fundamental robustness necessary for that. Namely, it needed some form of smart contract functionality. It needed some notion of how oracles would work. It needed all these kinds of components. It made no sense to go ahead and try to rebrand Bitcoin as something it really isn't to try to make it work from a marketing perspective. But again, that's my opinion, and he certainly built up a nice following and a nice little ecosystem. And they have done some things very well, like DPoS is a pretty interesting consensus system. Also, they are now starting to pay developers with blockchains. So that's a very nice alignment of the interest of the community with the interest of the development of the ecosystem. So I applaud them for that effort, but it's been a lot of hard learning and a lot of harsh lessons that have occurred over the last year with the Bitshares ecosystem to get there. So I'm glad they're working, and I'm glad Dan's actually been able to take what I helped him get started and build it into something that's actually contributed to the community.
Okay, cool. Well, before we start talking a bit more about the project you're working on and how the different protocols compare, first a little bit more about your visibility in the space. I believe you're probably one of the most articulate speakers in the Bitcoin space, but I hardly ever see you speaking at conferences. And I do know you tweet a lot about those conferences that you wish to speak there, but for some reason they're not asking you. So what's going on there?
I don't know. You'll have to ask the conference organizers. It's amazing. I've been invited to go speak in the country of Georgia, but not the state of Georgia, and I'm an American, so you draw some inferences there. There's been some organizers who've been tremendously friendly, like Eyal Abramovich with the virtual Bitcoin expos. Those are the conferences where you dial in and you have a little avatar and run around. I just recently spoke there. In fact, that's where the Foundations of a Programmable Society lecture came from. That was my presentation at the conference. I've also had a chance to speak at a tremendous amount of meetup groups around the world. I just got done speaking in Japan at both the Tokyo and the Osaka meetup groups, and that was a heck of a lot of fun. At the Tokyo meetup group, some people travel over 3 hours to come see me speak, so that was really an amazing experience, and I really appreciate that. Frankly, that's where Bitcoin is at. I don't believe Bitcoin is the Bilderberg with a private conference in the Caribbean that only 50 special people can attend. I think that it's a decentralized movement, and the real value comes from the meetups, and the real value comes from the everyday people. That's where it's fun, and that's where I enjoy speaking.
Yeah, but do you suspect it's because you are very outspoken also with regards to your criticism on Bitcoin or some of the other protocols, that you're not singing from the same hymn sheet or something?
Well, I mean, I'm not a Bitcoin maximalist, and so maybe that has something to do with it. But I don't know, man. It's like some people like me, some people really don't like me. Some people think I'm an evil sociopath secretly working with DARPA and the New World Order to bring about the doom of the world. So it's just any given Sunday and any given person that you want to talk to.
Are you working with Blythe Masters then, the old JP Morgan lady that joined the Bitcoin startup?
No. But evidently Ethereum is a co-opted Goldman Sachs venture. I don't know if that one is still floating around or not. But it was a lot of fun. A lot of people have too much time, I think. first off, Bitcoin's not a very big ecosystem, so I don't think if there was a new world order, they would be paying too much attention to it quite yet. Maybe in a few years, when it's $1 trillion market cap and it's like driving banks out of business, they'll get worried. But no, I mean, it's early days, and I'm not working with any evil intelligence cabal to bring about the doom of Bitcoin.
Okay, so
are we having fun yet?
Yeah. We have a question from the audience. Rico Brouwer, one of our viewers, he says he wants to know what's your take on some of these things. So we see someone from GPM, we saw it in the past too, that is joining Bitcoin startups. You think it's a good development, or you think they're trying to co-opt the space?
Well, I mean, it's very difficult to co-opt a decentralized system because you can just simply fork out whatever evils they've tried to put in. So I think it's actually a very positive development. I mean, banks are not homogeneous structures where everybody hierarchically just follows the party line. I mean, they're a collection of people and a collection of business activities. And for the most part, these business activities are stuck in the 1960s, 1970s, 1980s, and they're chained with a mountain of really insane regulations. In some cases, they're put there to ensure non-competition. So just, Bitcoin as a revolutionizer in settlements and clearing alone is a huge thing. But also, you can start thinking about the Internet of Identity and say, okay, if we start putting identities on blockchains, we can revolutionize KYC and AML. This also can revolutionize microfinance. So there's certainly a lot of people who say, boy, how do we don't have bank accounts? Boy, how do we more efficiently comply with regulation? Boy, how do we more efficiently move money around the world? They see these orders of magnitude improvement that Ripple, Bitcoin, and other ecosystems can bring, and they of course want to be the first in line for that, because it's important to recognize that banks are acquisition-happy industries. So generally, most of the innovation, like the pharmaceutical innovation ecosystem, occurs from some startup proving something and then instantly getting purchased. And those amounts are not small. They're several $100 million or several $1 billion. And so that's probably why we're seeing a lot of people jumping out of Goldman Sachs or JP Morgan. They'll be back, but they'll be back with bigger bank accounts when they get acquired.
Okay, let's talk a bit about the future, because in your presentation in December in Bermuda, the TEDx presentation, you talked a lot about decentralizing everything, and you had a very interesting example. You talked about this fictional character called Ahmed Khan. How's he doing, by the way? Is he still is he doing fine? Or?
Well, I hope he's doing well, but we don't have any paperwork on him, so we don't know where he's at.
Yeah. So your point was there's sorry, John.
So still no papers. We aren't there yet.
No papers. We don't need no stinking papers. This is Bitcoin.
So could you possibly, for the people that haven't seen your video, talk a bit about this person and what kind of products he need and how blockchain technology can help with that?
Sure. So when Nick asked me to speak at TED in Bermuda, he basically said, well, you need in 13 minutes to kind of break down the core value proposition of why decentralization and cryptocurrencies are used. I'm like, yeah, no pressure. So what I decided to do was kind of invent two characters, one Jeremy and the other one Ahmed Khan, and say, okay, this is a person who lives in the developed world, and then this is a person who lives in the developing world. How are they different? And where they were different is that if you think about proof of ownership, like deeds, titles, equities, all these things. If you think about risk measurement, if you think about documentation, in general, if you come from the developing world, these things are non-existent, or they're quite crude, or they tend to change when the governments change, which is quite often. So they can be corrupted. And so that's a humongous problem, because what it does is it means you can't really have a foundation to build wealth on top of. Hernando Soto Pilar wrote a lot of articles about this, and I think several books. And he just basically says there's $10 trillion of wealth that's just sitting locked up as a result of no documentation, no foundations. It's a very nasty thing. So we say, is there a place that's disintermediated from governments, disintermediated from geography, where we can actually put property rights and put legal agreements and put assets and start storing them there? And we know that even if the Taliban comes in and they change everything, that's still there. We know who the rightful owners to things are. That's the foundation of it. And then can we put actions, reputation, these kinds of things there? Because the minute you do that, you now have a credit system. If you have a credit system, you know who the people you can send money to are who will pay you back. And if you look at the value per finance credit, I mean, the interest rates are 35% to 85%, 35% most countries, 85% Azerbaijan, very expensive. So that's a pretty big ROI for a person who's willing to take that kind of risk. So even if you have, a halving of the rates, it's still much better than you'd ever get from a domestic loan. And these are not like, let's go buy a car for the sake of him saying. These are life-saving or life-changing loans that give people the ability to start businesses or the ability to actually build real wealth up. So I think that once we have solidified the technology, whether it be Bitcoin or Ripple or some amalgamation of different blockchain technologies, we'll start seeing very naturally a reputation system, an ID system, and a deed system occur. And then once that occurs, we'll actually start seeing a credit system be built up and an insurance system be built up for the first time ever for the developing world that's profitable for all actors involved. It's totally decentralized. And overall, what will occur is we'll see real wealth being built in these particular countries. And people's cell phones will effectively become their banks, and the cash hubs will be little ATMs in their villages, probably solar powered. So it's a very exciting future.
Yeah. So we have Tim Pastor here, and he's actually working on Identify, which ties neatly into this topic. Tim, what are your thoughts on this, and can you possibly explain to Charles what Identify is, if he hasn't yet heard of it?
Yeah, sure. Identify is a fork of the Bitcoin daemon. So the backend runs pretty much the same as the Bitcoin daemon does. So it has the same cryptography, the same command line interface, etc. Only we took out the blockchain. Because the blockchain, we think the blockchain is interesting if everybody wants to reach consensus on one certain thing. So let's say you have objective reality, that's for example a transaction. So if I send money to you, then we can all agree on if that's my money or not. But if I want to trust you, maybe I trust you, but other people don't trust you. So that's really subjective. It's subjective kind of logic. So that's why we don't use the blockchain for that. But it's basically a peer-to-peer network, and it works basically the same way as Bitcoin does, except for the blockchain. And what we're trying to do is solve the problem of identity and reputation for the same reason that Charles is mentioning. Because if we truly want to do business in the future with people on the other end of the world and want to make it possible for Mr. Khan in Afghanistan to trade with anybody anywhere in the world, then people need to know if they can trust him or not. And that's very difficult at the moment, because if I go to, let's say, a web shop in the United States or a Bitcoin exchange in Japan, then how do I know if I can trust the people who run this exchange or the web shop? So I think that's a pretty important ingredient for the, well, sometimes I call it the holy grail of decentralization. And we already have the decentralized money. People are working on a decentralized internet, and next to that I think we need decentralized identity and reputation in order to reach that phase. So what do you think, Charles?
Well, so first, how do you guys resolve the civil attack?
It's a whitelisting principle. So you only trust people you add yourself. And through those people...
so it's kind of like web of trust from that respect.
Yeah, it's a web of trust, exactly.
Okay.
This way anyone can make like 1 trillion identities, but as long as they're not linked to your own network, they will never influence your own network.
And the identities and be stored on a blockchain?
They can be, but it's not necessary.
Okay.
So you simply tie your identifiers to your identity, and if you confirm that a certain identifier belongs to your identity, then the people who trust you will see that it belongs to you, to your identity, and that you've verified it yourself. But as long as anybody can add any kind of identifier to your identity if they feel like it, but as long as you don't verify it yourself, it has no influence whatsoever on your own web of trust.
Okay, and so how do I add an identifier to my identity? Where do I find the identity? Is it like on your web server, or?
It's well, the backend is it's a peer-to-peer system, so everyone can run a node. All the data is being synchronized among all the nodes, and if you go to identity.fi, you can see one of the front ends we built. It is a prototype at the moment, but there you can basically see how it works, and you can create an identity over there, add identifiers, and you can also see the reputation part over there. So you can say somebody is a good haircutter, or somebody was a lousy car salesman, or whatever kind of reputation you want to send that way. So it's basically
I'll have to check it out. I haven't seen your service yet. I mean, but Tim is absolutely right. And by the way, guys, it's a bear of a problem from a cryptographic sense. First off, you have a revocation concern. So what happens if you lose your identity or it gets compromised? How do you transfer it to a new key pair? And then second, how do you actually store these things properly and authenticate yourself properly? If you think about the developing world, we say, oh, well, we just chain it to a cell phone. Well, what if your cell phone's multi-user? And you have multiple people for the same cell phone or multiple people for the same laptop, then storing your credentials on a piece of hardware, not necessarily a good idea. Although we're seeing some proliferation with TPMs and other things that may make that a little easier, and there's also a lot of biometrics that are coming online that are getting a little bit better. Although there's a lot of InfoSec guys that hate biometrics with an unrelenting passion. So there's a revocation concern. There's a Sybil concern. The Sybil attack is where you create a bunch of sock puppet accounts and go ahead and use those to make yourself look good. There's also a bootstrap effect. Like, you want to choose to trust people, but if I live in America, how do I trust people in Afghanistan? Unless I actually physically go there and meet people, how do I actually bring people into the ecosystem? So there generally is some form of curation there. The other issue is the issue of identification. So we tend to trust breeder documents for identification. So those are passports, driver's license, things like that. I'd encourage anybody listening to read John Clippinger's essay on this. It's called Self-Sovereign Identity Management. It's chapter 2 in the book, From Bitcoin to Burning Man. It's open source, so you can read it. Wonderful, wonderful write-up on some of the challenges. And anybody who enters into the space, I give them a lot of kudos, because it's a trial by fire. It's always a game of can't get gamed. Another fun thing to check out is there's a wonderful guy who wrote a book called Web Reputation Systems. His name is Randy Farmer. And right when he published the book in 2010, he went to Google for their little authors hangout, and he was talking about his experiences building over the last 10 years different reputation systems. And he mentioned the Sims Mafia. So for a little while, he was in charge of The Sims Online, and he kind of built out the reputation system for that. And people were gaming it to extort people so that they couldn't rent things or hold jobs by destroying the reputation by a civil attack. So even in MMORPGs, it's a perfect social experiment of where things can go wrong, especially when there's real value at stake, either digital or physical. So it's a bear of a problem. There's a lot of moving pieces to it, but I do think projects like Open Mustard Seed, or at least trying to define it in the proper way and move us in that direction. And I do think we're starting to see the hardware catch up, so that we actually get better ways of authenticating people and revoking things. Go ahead.
What if, like, the thing I always, that kind of bugs me is this person, Ahmed Khan, or anyone else in a developing nation, let's say he has a deed on the blockchain, then there's still the problem of enforceability, right? There's still the local mafia or governments or whatever, there's a difference, that can say, well,
here's the beautiful thing about enforceability. Here's the beautiful thing about enforceability. Most of these agreements tend to actually already be private. If in America or Europe, you tend to get into this mindset where everything is somewhat regulated or controlled by government. But really think about it: how often does the government get involved when you buy something at McDonald's or Wendy's? You usually don't. I just bought a Baconator triple, really good sandwich. No, I'm not working for them, by the way. But anyway, they had nothing to do with that transaction. Now, if there was some issue, they would probably come in. Commerce tends to be private.
Yeah, but of course, with the bigger goods, governments are involved with the bigger goods, right? When it's land registry or car registry, governments are, at least in the developed nations, are always involved. And I guess also in the developing
world, they actually tend not to be. And if you have tribal land rights or something like that, then the local government or local tribe will probably tend to agree if there's some non-reputable. At least in my idealized world, they'll tend to agree. But it's all a matter of a social network. Governments are creatures of social property rights are creatures of social consensus. So if you get enough people behind a system, the system ends up actually being the system. Look at Bitcoin. I mean, it started in January 3rd, 2009. You couldn't even buy anything with it. I remember watching people running around selling 5,000 Bitcoins on Excel spreadsheets for a few bucks. And then somebody bought a pizza for 10,000 of them. There's a wonderful book called $1 Million Pizza, and that's a $10 million pizza. Or actually, I guess it's a $3 million pizza right now at current rates. And so it's just all about the social component. There's a lot of of that in it. So if you start getting property rights into a disintermediated structure and people tend to agree about it, overall people will follow that. Now, there are some international legal frameworks which courts will uphold. Unit right is one, maritime law is another. In fact, there's a long precedent of this. If you look at Lex Mercatoria, well back in the Middle Ages, people agreed it was a good idea for merchants to have their own law that was not the same as the country's law. In fact, even during the time of the Roma, there was poly law where Roman citizens, the locals in the particular colonies. So there's historical precedent for multiple legal systems, in some cases private legal systems, especially dealing with commercial property. And I think that we could definitely apply these in the developing world, especially if the citizens in that area just by consensus agree to follow that over the government standards, because it's better, it's more fair, it's less prone to corruption. And in the international community may end up using that as their benchmark, especially for elections, if you're doing voting on blockchain.
Charles, you already touched base on this when we started this conversation, but I know that you went to Japan recently and traveled around for a bit. What's the current state of bitcoins and blockchains in Japan? Because Holland is always very fast with adoption, but my feeling is that Japan always is a bit faster. Can you tell me anything about what you noted there?
Well, I'll tell you, within the Bitcoin community there, I have met, I've seldom met people who are as passionate, as bright, and as amazing. There was one guy in particular, Jimmy Hama, who has just an amazing heart. He was a great guy, and he was incredibly friendly. So the community there is great. In fact, the Bitcoin meetup group in Tokyo is the second oldest in the world, only to Silicon Valley, and I think they beat them only by a few months. So the community is great, but it's small. And it's important to understand that the mainstream of Japan are still kind of recovering from Mt. Gox. In fact, I had more than one conversation in Osaka where when I mentioned Bitcoin, they said, didn't that go out of business? So there's a little bit of growth that's going to be required. But I think that's actually because we have a lot of hindsight and we have a lot of knowledge, but it's as if it was 2011 or 2012 as a market. So any company wanting to go there, I think, can make some great inroads. And it's the third largest economy in the world. It's mostly a cash rate, really pushed into the credit card space. So this could be an opportunity to leapfrog credit card adoption and move from the Apple Pay model to a cryptocurrency model. So I think there's a lot of opportunity in that market. And there also is a huge opportunity in Korea. There's a huge opportunity in China. And if you're in the remittance market, I think the best remittance market in the world is going to be the Philippines, because it's the second largest by size and first largest, I think, by value compared to population. India is the first largest. So Philippines is great, Indonesia is great, and Japan, I think, is going to be a phenomenal hub. It's also important to point out that their economy is not doing too well. So you can pick up developers a little bit more cheaply than you could in the United States, and they tend to be a hell of a lot more loyal than the Silicon Valley kid. So I really love doing business in Japan. It's a beautiful country, and I love Jimmy and the rest of the people there. They're phenomenal. They got big hearts.
So were you recruiting people for your new project? Could you tell us a little bit more about the project you're working on now, Charles?
I think my LinkedIn page says it best. We're in the business of doing business for the purpose of business.
Okay, that's very clear. Okay, next topic.
We're still running in silent mode for the day. It's going to be a little bit more before we divulge it, but it's really exciting. We're working with oracles and smart contracts. We're taking a look at a lot of different tech in the space, and we kind of have the luxury of picking and choosing what we like. And it's going to be a product focused in Japan, Korea, and China initially, with extensions into Indonesia and to the Philippines. And we're really interested in hardware and software currently, so we're trying to put that all together. I hope that's sufficiently ambiguous and vague.
Which platform are you using?
Is that?
Which platform are you using? Is it Ethereum?
Probably the
Ripple?
core of our platform will be based on Ripple with some modifications, but that's what we're looking at today. We still have a lot more architecture work and just happy fun time at the whiteboard before we actually come to that decision.
So is your company going to be named 42?
Input Output Hong Kong. Yeah, so IOHK. And we haven't even built our website yet. We're so like silent mode. We don't even care about our website. It's iohk.io. At some point, we'll put something interesting up there. But if you pay attention to my Twitter feed, outside of me getting tickets for having my dog off the leash at a dog park, I occasionally announce important things too. So Probably the best way of finding out.
I was trying to decrypt that dog message to find out more about the actual intent, but
right.
that was just a dog message.
It's actually a very elegant thing. Every tweet has embedded in it a secret component, and all of them summed together into some sort of Kaiser Sose or something like that.
And Charles, when we had a talk last week, you expressed a few concerns with regards to Bitcoin and the centralization of mining. Can you tell us a bit more about how you see Bitcoin now and what you advise the developers to do to make it better?
Well, there's a couple problems I have. Well, the first fundamental problem is that the consensus algorithm naturally becomes federated. There's no way to get around that. So let's just look at the money. So right now we produce 25 Bitcoins every block. That's every 10 minutes, hopefully. If the price goes to $10,000, which is what everybody wants, then all of a sudden you have $250,000 every 10 minutes that's produced. That's a fact. There's no way of running around that. And yeah, sure, it'll half to 12.5, but what if Bitcoin goes to 100,000 Bitcoin? That's 1.2 million, right? So we're producing a lot of value very quickly. And what happens is competition naturally will push engineers and companies to try to get as much of an edge as possible to absorb as much of that value as possible. Well, if you're thinking as a hardware designer, at some point the economics work their way out that the NRE becomes too high that you don't really want to share your mining hardware with the general public. And in practice, we've already seen a lot of moral hazards here with Butterfly Labs and other mining companies basically just hanging on to that mining hardware for a little bit too long and then eventually shipping it when the profits were no longer there. It's like, oh, there's no conflict of interest around a mining pool. Well, actually there is. And then with cloud mining, it's actually the same problem. So the natural configuration, because of NRE and because of the competitive nature of the market, is for 5 or 10 actors to control more than 51% of the hash power with private. That's just the way it's going to be. So we'll have federation without any transparency, unlike federation and Ripple networks. So proof of work will do that. On the other hand, proof of work is a very nice consensus algorithm in that you gain certain guarantees that you normally don't get with other consensus algorithms. Like, for example, if you're the first time ever joining the network, you don't have to trust anybody. You just take a look at the algorithmic weight behind all the proposed chains, and whichever one has the most weight, that's your chain. That's what you go with. You don't get that with proof of stake, and you don't get that with other BFT systems. So there's good with the bad, but the bad is that you get federation. Okay, so that's one problem, and people have to come to terms with it. The other problem is that if you look at the expansion model that's being proposed, namely sidechains, my understanding of it is that even though you can use a separate currency, if you're chaining your currency to Bitcoin, people are just going to probably use Bitcoins on your network to do whatever the network does. So if we create a sidechain of Ethereum, you'll probably have Bitcoins being used to power that sidechain. That's great, but really the analogy is I have an office building, and I welcome your startup to come be in my office building, but I get all your equity. As a designer of a sidechain, if Bitcoin is your currency, all the innovation that you created, all the value you created goes to Bitcoin. It doesn't go to your own incumbent currency. So that's great for the people who already own Bitcoin, but not so good for the actual innovators in the space who are continuing to add new features and functionality. So that's a problem in my mind, unless I'm misunderstanding the whole thing, which is entirely possible. Maybe I'm not getting it. But it does make sense why 4 of the 6 core developers want to work for that company then, and all the early adopters of Bitcoin are really fired up about a company like that, because that kind of makes Bitcoin a very hierarchical thing, where the other, and this is more of an economic philosophy, is it assumes that the distribution of Bitcoin is perfect. So let's say, for the sake of the argument, that Bitcoin can do everything. Well, it's not owned by everybody. It's only owned by top 100 people own more than 50% of the coins. So we've replaced the Rockefellers and the Morgans and the Rothschilds with the Voorheeses and the Vers and the Nakamotos. We've kind of made that configuration, and they're early adopters, they deserve to have their due, but I don't think we should replace a very controlled hierarchical top-down currency with another very controlled federated hierarchical top-down currency. I think we rather should have a completely opposite model, which is an internet of blockchains, where we have many different blockchains that are all specific to different geographies, different ethnicities, different use cases, different distributions, and you have decentralized exchange between all of them. All the chains can talk to each other, all the chains can do things together, and no one chain is the dominant chain, and each chain perhaps has specific uses. For example, Ethereum might be your default go-to chain for smart contract processing, whereas Bitcoin might become the de facto store of value in the ecosystem. I think that's a much more realistic and reasonable way of going about things, because we don't have just one of anything. There's not one country, one religion, one programming language. We have many, many, many types of things, and whether anybody wants it or not, there's going to be 50 of everything. So that's probably realistically what's going to happen. And I think that's a better effect. The other thing that concerns me is there's no incentive for data relay right now. So if you ever wonder about taking a Bitcoin node and you've downloaded the software for the first time, how do you actually bootstrap into the network? The bootstrap nodes, my understanding is, are volunteer. So that's fine, but what if somebody DDoSes those? You actually can't connect to the network. So that's a problem. The other problem is, what if we keep doing more and more and more things over the Bitcoin network? What's the bandwidth requirement going to be? You know, a node is going to be relaying many megabits of communications for free. And that's not necessarily a good economic model. It doesn't seem to scale. So you need to have metered transmission just as much as you need to have incentives for securing the network. So I think the incentive structure is a little screwy. The last thing I'll mention is the incentive behind development. I think Bitshares has done some good things in this respect, but I have a fundamental problem with 4 of the 6 core developers working for one company, and the other one working for BitPay, and the other one working for the foundation. I have a problem when somebody's building software for me that they work for for-profit entities that don't necessarily have the interest of the ecosystem in mind. I'm not saying they're bad people or they're going to do bad things, but I tend to believe that people always will behave in the long run in their economic best interest. And so with fundamentally different economic best interests, the interest of this entity versus this entity, that creates a moral hazard. So I firmly believe that Bitcoin needs to have its own treasury at some point, that developers can frankly work for and be paid out, and there's some sort of stakeholder system for selecting who gets to work for it. And even if we put 1% of the mining fees, what do we mint? Like 600 million last year? I forget. If we take 1% of this and we put it into a treasury, we could probably have 30 or 40 developers working full-time just for the Bitcoin blockchain. And their economics are directly aligned with the incentive of the ecosystem. They don't have equity in some for-profit company, which may or may not want to do what's best for the ecosystem or for the community. So that's just kind of my take. I think the incentives are not properly aligned. I think the consensus algorithm will naturally lead to federation. I think that the innovation model is very predatory to one distribution that happens to be tremendously biased to people who got very lucky to be in early and not necessarily doing any innovation, although some still are. And so I think that we need to rethink this a bit and realize that at the end of the day, it was an experiment. And the thing about experiments is they come to an end and you learn from them, and then you go use them to build more experiments and better things. You don't necessarily try to, take some old thing and keep rebuilding and refactoring and reforming it until somehow it can actually serve all of your needs, whether they're the enterprise, consumer, and they're totally global. I think it's a very naive viewpoint.
It would be interesting if you could debate these things with Andreas Antonopoulos, for example, one day. That should be like a public debate between you and him, for example, about some of these topics. It sometimes seems like people are talking to their own subgroups within a space, but there's not enough debate taking place about some of these issues, for example, here in a show like this.
Well, I do appreciate the opportunity to talk about it. I mean, I love having these kinds of conversations. Are there any questions from the audience or from you guys? Or?
Yeah, we got a question here from Diego Correa Tristain. He asks, do you recognize an utopia behind the concept of blockchain contracts, and which are the main goals to accomplish for this technology to be adopted as a common service in cities around the world?
Do I recognize, what was the word? I'm sorry?
A utopia, possibly.
Utopia in blockchain contracts. I am so happy about private law and so happy about smart contracts because, I mean, if you really think about where we're going with this, we're talking about creating an object-oriented legal system that's completely algorithmic with real government weight behind it. There's absolutely no reason once digital signature rights are well understood and that governments begin to recognize these things as assets that we can't create algorithmic self-enforcing contracts and basically create a whole bunch of open source libraries and have millions of people contribute to them and learn from when things are poorly formed and learn from when things are well formed. And just like what we're seeing with the JavaScript framework, like Angular versus Ember versus React versus Meteor and this enormous innovation there, see the same kind of innovation with legal systems. So I do think that that's going to be probably one of the greatest innovations of the 21st century in terms of governance. The other thing I'm really excited about is actually Bitcoin being used for cryptocurrencies in general, being used for voting. basically you can do a full CINA compliant election. It's confidential, you have integrity, you have non-repudiation, and you have authentication, but you also can start taking things like liquid feedback, liquid democracy, and mixing it into the fray. You can take things like saying, okay, I can do fractional voting. You can try other voting systems like Condorcet or Borda systems, so linear preference orderings as opposed to just strict plurality. And that's going to be really fun and exciting. And the other exciting thing is DAOs, decentralized autonomous organizations, where you have a treasury, you have some representatives who reflect that, you have some constitution that maybe is written in a formal language like a cockproof or something like that. And these things working together with all those other things, algorithmic law and these better consensus systems for selecting leadership, I think we're ending up getting wonderfully well-run organizations, very transparent organizations, and eventually it's going to have a substantial impact on governments. So I think the word utopia is actually accurate. This is going to be a huge innovation, and as soon as people get it and they really understand it, they will demand it. That's something Herman Cain used to say. He says, if they understand it, they will demand it. And I believe the same thing for smart contracts, oracles, and all these other magical things.
Awesome. Well, it sounds like a very interesting future ahead of us. Job, Tim, any questions for Charles?
Yeah,
any questions? Go ahead. Sorry.
Since you were talking about Bitcoin as being like an experiment, I agree with you on that one. But at the same time, you also see that any merchant who accepts any cryptocurrencies, at least 90% of them accept Bitcoin. So what do you think, or how do you see the probability of Bitcoin disappearing over the next 10 or 20 years? Because personally, I think it's going to be difficult. There either has to be...
No, but I don't think that's going to be an issue at all, Tim, because they're accepting Bitcoin through BitPay. They're accepting it through an intermediary. So what's to stop BitPay from saying we accept Litecoin, Darkcoin, Ripple, and everything else in between? If they were building all proprietary logic, it would be like me saying, let's get rid of... Like Fido and Squirrel both have this problem. They say, we want to get rid of passwords on the internet. We want to replace them with these new mechanics. And you're absolutely right when you say, oh, that's not going to happen, because there's a billion websites that would have to be recoded to support this. But if everybody was getting their user authentication from a third-party service, and that third-party service upgraded itself to support some new authentication mechanism, which is what we're seeing with OpenID and other things like that, then I think it's actually reasonable to say that we could get rid of passwords then. And similarly, the same for Bitcoin. The other thing is Bitcoin's price and volatility has a huge impact. Whether merchants take this seriously or not. If it's going to the moon and it's actually fairly stable for long plateaus, more people will say this is a good idea. But for the most part, we can't get things like lending. We can't get things like natural unit of account if the price changes 20 or 30%. And frankly, it's never going to stabilize. Because it has a fixed supply and you have nonlinear demand. This is not a situation where we have some sort of central bank trying to keep things even. This is a situation where coins are produced like this regardless, and then after 4 years it halves, and then they're produced like this, and it has. And demand goes up and up and up down. Okay, there's nothing that's going to change that. So I don't agree that we're going to see a vast reduction in volatility in the next 5 or 10 or 15 years. So most merchants, the only way they'll touch it is through a middleman like BitPay. And if they're doing that, then BitPay can change whichever coin they accept, and the merchant doesn't give a damn because they're getting settlement with dollars.
If Bitcoin is what it is, it isn't even possible to do that. We're talking about a revolutionary technique here, and we want a stable price. Huh? That's
I know.
That's the complete opposite.
And that's why I believe in an internet of blockchains, and that's why I believe in derivatives like CFDs and other things like that. And Pebble's doing some interesting work. So, there's a reason why I participated in Bitshares. It's because I don't think that we're ever going to get that from Bitcoin, nor should we ask that of Bitcoin. We should try to do some experiments to see how to do it through other sandboxes.
I'm very interested. Oh, sorry, Tim, but I'm very interested to know. Currently, on your product, where you can't say a lot about, you choose to use Ripple. Up until now, you just said. What's the main reason for that? Actually,
well, because we have a federated backend, and it's assumed to be federated, and then we have an open front end, and so it seemed like a really nice ecosystem to explore and play with. But we might do a multi-layered system where we use Ripple and Tendermint together. But again, there's a lot of work that needs to be done before we can talk about it.
Okay.
In the beginning of the show, you were talking about also about the volatility of Bitcoin and about the experiment of pegging cryptocurrencies to, let's say, US dollar, for example.
Right.
Isn't that basically like the same principle as printing extra US dollars?
Not necessarily, because once you get a peg to a certain type of asset, there's no reason why you can't take that peg and create a basket. Like Vend is trying to do this, right? Where you say we have a basket of a whole bunch of different things, and we try to create a value-neutral instrument. So the first experiment is take something very simple, very transparent, very easy to peg to, and once you get that done, then you can start talking about a multipeg, where you can actually create something a bit better, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, that sounds fair enough.
Okay.
Another question then, because you were talking about Bitshares. Are you familiar with the new system, new shares and new bits?
Yeah, I think Dan really hates that a lot. So I guess
yeah,
I should
was
start
wondering
thinking there was something.
Can you? Is it possible for you to describe the difference? Because it looks like they're aiming at the same thing, With
I've heard about it, but I haven't.
Okay.
I've heard about it, but I haven't deeply looked at that ecosystem. I mean, there's only a finite amount of time, and honestly, I've been spending so much more time doing digital identity management, Augur, and all these other things. It's hard to kind of circle back there. At some point, I probably will look at it, but it's it is an interest of time.
And any studies you did already on? Helpful. Oh, yeah, no problem, no problem. On anything on Factum, on Tether you want to share, on some other 2.0 stuff I saw recently?
Well, Factum, I'm technically an advisor for Factum, so I don't know what that means exactly, but I am. Actually, I have a lot of respect for Paul Snow. I think he's a really nice guy, and he's a really bright guy too, and he's been nothing but kind to me throughout the entire time I've known him in the cryptocurrency days, which has been for a while. And Factum really is doing something that is necessary for business standpoint. What the value of that is, we don't really know. We have to build a business around it and find out. But really what they're doing is saying you have a set of records that you need to anchor to something where they can't be tampered with and they're immutable, and you need to timestamp them and verify integrity. And we're just giving a super easy way for businesses to do that. It's important to understand that it's not a decentralized database. It's not storage or IPFS, but it is an integrity service. And so that's a very valuable business service, and it's yet another way to get businesses on board and start thinking about Bitcoin as an ecosystem rather than Bitcoin as a currency. So I think there's something there. And again, I don't know what the value of that is, or if that's a $5 product or a $500 million product. That's for the market to decide. But I also think that along that thought process, you can start seeing how things can plug together. Like, for example, once you have that infrastructure there, if MateSafe is doing well, maybe you can plug that in. Now we have a completely decentralized database with an integrity ledger. Okay, and if Ethereum is doing really well or Eris is doing really well, maybe we can plug that in, and now we can start talking about building a distributed supercomputer and do distributed hosting and these kinds of things. So there's a lot of modularity to these kinds of ideas, and it's just a matter of getting them interoperable, plugging together. So I think all of them are quite positive, as long as they're well managed and they have good talent behind them and they don't blow all their money on coke and hookers. It's kind of the quintessential rule.
Yeah.
don't spend your actually innovate.
Great. Well, Charles, we've been speaking for already 50 minutes. Anything you want to add? Oh, there's one question popping up from another viewer. Shall we do this as the last question, Charles?
Sure.
From Neil Human. He asks, do you not think that blockchain-based voting systems will result in monetary value being added to each vote? This would at least make the current system of corporate-funded election manipulation more transparent and visible in the public ledger.
Oh, no.
I don't know. I mean, who gets to be on the ballot? Second, what do you get to vote on? Third, what's the incentive to vote? I mean, there's a fundamental problem with all voting system trying to resolve with DPoS, but I don't think they're doing a good job yet. It's why do I care? So we have this notion of rational ignorance. So if I go and I become an expert on Social Security and Medicare and all these other American issues that are very vexing, and I invest huge amounts of time into it, my vote counts exactly the same as the guy who voted for that guy because he liked his hair. So basically what I do is I say my vote doesn't really mean anything. It's not really worth anything. So it really is interesting to see if you can actually attach an economic value to a vote, or let people buy votes or other things. Maybe that's a better system. I don't know. But I'm a big believer in innovation and competition. I'm also a big believer in trying to align incentives with what you accomplish. If you want people to take voting seriously, you got to give them something for it. Either you give them more voice if they invest more time, or you give them a payout for participation. But if you give them nothing and you say it's your civic duty, you end up with a tragedy of the commons, where you end up with Obama or Bush. You don't really get a good system. So I think there needs to be a fundamental renaissance, and I am participating in one project called Clearvoter, where we're into that. But that's going to be a little bit down the pipe, and hopefully I'll be able to publish something interesting.
Right. Okay. Thanks. Anything you want to add, Charles?
No, but I would like to thank everybody for listening and giving me the opportunity to talk. And you can reach me at any time at my Twitter feed, which is underneath my name, or at my email, charles.hoskinson@gmail.com, and I'll try to reply. When I was running my Udemy course, I had over 50,000 students, and I got 5,400 emails, and I replied to every single one of them. So a life I have. But I'd be happy to get your emails and at the very least point you in the right direction. Thank you guys for your time. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you, Charles. It was fun to have you on. And yeah, once you go live with your new product, give us a heads up, and possibly you want to return to the show.
Sure, absolutely. Talk to you guys soon.
Okay, talk to you later. Bye.
Bye-bye.